Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Ostler. My guests on today's podcast, two wonderful women that are in our home, are my friends Benée Larsen and Heidi Dutson.
Dutson, yes.
Dutson.
That's okay. Happens all the time.
Welcome to the podcast. I met these two wonderful women when I was asked to speak at a faith leadership summit, a suicide prevention faith leader summit that Benée invited me to speak at in September. And I kind of got a much clearer understanding of the wonderful work that's being done in the state of Utah in kind of a coalition basis to help prevent suicide and to provide support for families who have lost someone to suicide. And I invited these two women to be on the podcast to share what they're doing and their insights to help bring more understanding to this really important topic that affects and potentially affects all of us. Benée Larsen is the Prevention by Design Director at NAMI. NAMI stands for the National Alliance of Mental Illness in Utah. And Heidi Peterson Dutson, is that right?
That's right.
Is the Prevention Administrator and the Regional Director for the Utah Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health. And so we said a prayer, and we just hope that this will be helpful for you as local leaders, as parents, as those of you that are working through mental health issues, just to bring more understanding. So if I do a good job, I won't talk much more and let these women share the things that they've prepared. But I'd love for each of you to just introduce yourself to our listeners so they know more about you. Let's have Benée go first.
All right. Thanks for having us today, Richard. My name's Benée Larsen. I work at NAMI Utah, which Richard introduces the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And part of what I do at NAMI is I have a grant from the state that I oversee for suicide prevention. And this grant, we then award mini grants to local coalitions from across the state. So Tooele, Davis County, Salt Lake County, all the way down to Kane County, which it allows coalition work and communities to better serve their communities in what's best to help prevent suicide in their communities. As part of that grant, I co-chair the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition with Allison Faust, who works at the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health. So, and within that coalition, there are 7 work groups. And one of those work groups is a faith work group. And I am honored and I love that I get to co-chair this faith work group with Travis Bear he works for LDS Family Services. And Travis and I co-chair this faith work group. And it's one of my favorite things that I get to do for my work. But our purpose is really to bring faith leaders from across the state, from across different denominations, to help them understand and better know how to talk about suicide within their congregations, make it a safe space so that we can prevent suicide. So I am happy to be here today. I'll turn it over to Heidi.
Thank you, Benée.
Thank you. I'm also super thrilled to be here. Big fan of this podcast and of your work, Richard. So thank you for that. As you mentioned, I'm a regional director and administrator with the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health. I guess the beginnings of this work for me started in some coalition work that I was involved in. I found myself as a coordinator for a Communities That Care coalition out in Tooele City. And, many people don't know this, but there's actually a whole field of science when it comes to prevention. And I was acquainted with this when I was about 30 and became so excited about it that I actually did a career pivot.
Wow.
And started a career in prevention. And some of what the science teaches us is that, there's really things we can dig into as parents, as leaders, when we're concerned about our youth, that we can discover certain risk factors and then also what we call protective factors. So things we want more of that protect our youth from things like substance abuse, suicide ideation. And then, of course, we know that there's things that put them at a higher risk. And those things are the things that we want to reduce. So I began my prevention work in Tooele City, taught parenting classes, and then helped run this coalition. And in about 2014, I can talk more about this a little later, but we had a rash of suicides in our county that really hurt us all. My son was a senior in high school at that time, and was very impacted by that. And so we knew professionally, also as a coalition, we wanted to make sure that we were doing what we could to address that. And one of the gaps, as we were kind of assessing our work there, we recognized that we hadn't done a lot to involve faith leaders. And we certainly recognize that faith leaders have a large impact on our youth, and maybe even more so in the cultures and climates of their congregation. Is it a safe place to talk about mental health? Is it a safe place to talk about things that we're struggling with? And if not, how can we shift that? So that's when we did our first faith summit in Tooele City. I think that first year we had 50 faith leaders gather for half a Saturday.
Cool.
And when we accomplished that, I thought, wow, this is a need, because to take a half a Saturday away from anybody, especially a faith leader that, primarily that's done on volunteer time, it really told me that, number one, this is really important. And number two, there's enough need and concern and fear out there for those that we love, that people are willing to take the time to invest. So over time, as my career shifted, and I had the privilege of coming to work for the state of Utah, I was able to associate with Travis and Benée. In fact, Travis came and spoke at one of our Tooele City faith summits that we had. And then this wonderful faith work group was established that Benée already talked about. And it's truly one of my favorite meetings that I look forward to. And honestly, there is such a feeling of compassion, and putting maybe some of our, the tenets of faith that maybe we don't all agree upon, that's all set aside. And we're all coming together with this united intention of bringing hope and healing to faith congregations throughout our state. It's really a powerful concept and a powerful group to be a part of.
I love that. And I love the phrase you just used, Heidi, of united intention. I sense you've used that phrase before. No one's ever used that. And I think that is a meaningful phrase. And as I attended the Faith Leader Summit, I felt the same things you two women are talking about, is we can all be unified on this issue. And I think we're drawn to spaces right now where we can be unified and work together to solve a major challenge in our community. So, and potentially role model this for other things that we face, other challenges where we can, I like the word tenet also, we can kind of set aside the perhaps the tenets that might divide us, but find unity in the common ground we have to solve problems. So the principles I think you'll share on the podcast apply to lots of spaces we're in. So I'll just let you two women continue to talk.
All right.
You're up, Benée.
So as Heidi and I were talking about how we wanted to frame this, we thought it would be a really good idea just to let your listeners know about the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition and the work that we do there. For those of you who have not seen the billboards that say Live On, or have never been to liveonutah.org, that is our website for all things suicide prevention here in Utah. You can go to the resource tab, and there is a faith button, and you can click there to see all of the work that we have done over the last couple of years in this faith space. You can even see Richard do his presentation that he did this year for us, which was excellent. But I think we can kind of backtrack from there and explain where it came from and how we got to this point, because we're really excited to look at the progress we've made and the impact we hope that we're having, and hopefully moving forward, it will just continue to grow. So I think Heidi gets a lot of the credit for this, because she held those first summits in Tooele, and we modeled what we did with the state off of what Heidi did. So I don't know if Heidi wants to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, thank you, Benée. And I can never take, in prevention, you can never take credit solely for anything because, and that's really one of the beautiful benefits of prevention is if prevention is anything, it's relationships and it's collaborations, right? And so it was really a kind of a vulnerable lean into like, okay, we're going to try to engage faith leaders and will they want to be a part of it? And then I mentioned in the introduction that, my senior son that year at his particular high school, he was actually the senior class president.
Wow.
And they had lost 4 youth to suicide that year. And I will never forget after the first student died by suicide. This was, I think, late January of his senior year. And he had known that somebody had died by suicide. He didn't know who it was. And he came home on a Friday afternoon and he was just heavy-hearted about this. And I think he felt a sense of responsibility because, he loved his school and he loved, being part of what they tried to create and what it meant to go to Tooele High School. So he was heavy-hearted that somebody had died by suicide, but he didn't know who that was. Well, I did the best I could at the time to help him through that. I didn't know then what I know now. But he went back to school on Monday and came home even more heavy-hearted. And I could just see this in his body language. And so I said, Bud, talk to me. What's going on? And he said, Mom, I went to health class today and the chair in front of me was empty.
Wow.
He said, it was her mom. She's the one that died. And I learned a couple super powerful things that day because, there was this moment in space where it's like my son, wasn't best friends with this girl, but he knew that he shared a classroom. He shared space. He walked past her in the halls. And I learned then that when we lose a person to suicide, we really cannot measure the impact of loss there. And of course, the closer we're associated, maybe the more impactful that loss. But even just that sharing of space was very, very impactful to my son. The second thing I learned from that is that when there is a death by suicide, it was kind of indicated in what he said to me next. And he started saying things like, Mom, what if I would have known her better? What if last Thursday when she was in class, I would have asked her how her day was going, And so, we know and recognize that with suicide, this is often the case. And there's a sense of blame that we put on ourselves and responsibility. And so I know if I were to ask anybody here, or certainly any of the listeners, like, was her death my son's fault? Well, of course it wasn't his fault, and he shouldn't feel any of that blame. And yet we have this contrary because we ask ourselves, has there ever been a time when somebody is hurting like that girl was hurting and had the risk that she had where somebody knew, somebody saw, and courageously intervened to have a discussion and to get that person connected with some resources, to connect them with hope and help them remember reasons that life is still worth living? And of course, the answer to that is yes. Of course, we know that can happen. And so that kind of became this passion and kind of what drove our Faith Summit in the beginning. And Maya Angelou said, I love this quote of hers, is that when we know better, we do better. And so this opportunity and what came from that through, I started teaching QPR trainings. And if any of your listeners are familiar with that, or if they're not, we encourage them, again, to go on the Live On website. I'm sure there's resources there.
There are. You can even request a training.
Yeah.
But QPR stands for Question,
Yes.
Persuade, and Refer.
Yeah. Question, Persuade, and Refer. And that's actually, I like to think of QPR as like the mental health equivalent of CPR. So it is for mental health what CPR can do for somebody that's in a physical crisis. It usually can be taught within 90 minutes, gives you some excellent gatekeeper skills, how to recognize those that are in a crisis, and maybe even more importantly, what to say. And I know before I had the training I did, the subject of suicide was so intimidating. In fact, I remember sitting in my first training and I couldn't say the word suicide without just feeling this big old lump in my throat.
Sawdust.
Those words just kind of had to get past. And after that first training, I think it was a 3-day thing. I remember feeling like this suicide prevention hangover. That's what I call it was heavy, right?
Heavy.
And I needed me some happy vibes after that. But the things that we can learn in suicide prevention are super powerful, because the truth is that really all suicide prevention is about is recognizing when kind of having our antenna out, recognizing when people are hurting and having the courage to show the compassion, to just be a good friend, and creating, Richard, very much like you do through this podcast, this safe place where somebody knows they can open up and express their hurt without being judged or shamed, and that they can have this willingness to be connected to resources that can really bring a sense of hope to their life.
A great segment. Thank you.
Let's
see, where do we go from there?
I know. So about 4 years ago, because this is where I come into the story.
Yeah.
I started at NAMI. It's like 4.5 years ago. And my former boss, his name is Kim Gardner. He had this feeling, prompting, you can call it whatever you want, that he needed to create a statewide faith leader summit. Like that was his purpose. And he knew he was going to be retiring. And so I got to kind of walk on this journey with him. And I know Heidi was part of that original, but he really started with baby steps and reaching out to individuals from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and trying to get a feel on their thoughts on it. And it took a little bit, and it took some prodding and some time. But Travis Bear, who co-chairs the group with me now, has always been, it's part of his role in the church. He's the suicide prevention expert for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he came to our statewide coalition meetings. And this was before there was a faith summit or a faith work group. And when these conversations started to be had, we knew he had to be at the table. And so it started as kind of this advisory board, and they got individuals from leadership from the LDS Church, but also other community leaders to kind of discuss what could we do, what should we do, how can we address suicide in our congregations. And so we decided to do kind of the summit model where we would bring them together for a day and have a keynote and some breakout sessions and kind of go from there and see what happens. And our first summit was 4 years ago in April. It was April, May, maybe it was a May. And we had about 100 people attend. And we were pretty happy, ecstatic, but it was so fun to have conversations in a safe place. And I worked the resource table that day and had different leaders from the Relief Society. We had priesthood leadership. We had the general board from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we got to have these really great conversations, and people were really hungry for what to do, what to say, how to say it. And I kind of walked away that day on this kind of high. You get this, because it felt so good to have a safe place where we could talk about it and tell our faith leaders that it's okay to talk about it. Talking about suicide isn't going to put it into somebody's head. It's not going to cause somebody to think about it. And it kind of created this guide of what we could do moving forward and how can we continue to have these conversations. And we went from that first faith summit, and then we kind of were like, well, I don't know, what do we do now? And decided, maybe we need to to keep it up and see how we can expand. And, we had one the next year, and that increased to I think we had maybe 120 who attended. But then this funny thing called COVID happened. And last 2 summers ago, we decided to do it virtually. And we did some just 4 days worth of 1 day a week for a month, I think is how we did it. And we had just different topics. Like, let's see, we did kind of a suicide prevention 101. We did one about creating safe spaces. Let's see, what was it? Oh, dang. My brain went
It's
blank.
all on the Live On website.
It's on the Live On website. It's pretty cool because the last 2 years were virtual, we have them all recorded. But
that's cool.
Yeah, so that you could, figure out how to minister to those who were maybe in a minority group, whether that's LGBTQ plus or just within the minority population. That has been one of our most downloaded and watched sessions. It was excellent. So it allowed us to have content that we could put online, and it lives now on our Live On website, which any faith leader can go and utilize. And then this year's, we were able to do it as a hybrid, where we had people in person. We had about 60 or so of us in person to keep us safe. But then we had over 350 online, which to me is so fulfilling, but also amazing, because that shows the need that people wanted to hear how to prevent suicide, how to talk about it, the resources that are available. And, our hope is that we just get to continue to move this forward and touch more people, more faith leaders from across the state. So if you are a faith leader out there, please go to the website and reach out if you're interested in learning more. But, I think that is this passion that we have, and this I feel really blessed that I get to do this as part of my job, but I also get to sit in a meeting once a month and talk about my faith and the blessing that it is that I know that there's this reason that we're all here, and we're here to help one another. And we get to have this conversation with those from the Catholic faith or Baptist faith, or just different congregations and different faith leaders that have this same passion to want to save lives.
I loved, just listeners, my perspective being there for the first time. I did speak, but I loved hearing different faith leaders, and they were all terrific. And the men and women that participated were just outstanding. And there was just a common theme of how we can do better. We know better, we do better. And the panel that I think you led, Heidi, was just terrific. We ended up having Shayla Slaymaker on the podcast. She lost 2 brothers to suicide, and she was just remarkable and courageous in that
Such
panel.
a strong woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved your idea of having panel, to have people, all 4 of those panelists were just terrific. And for her courage to talk about this just worst case, unbelievable nightmare in her family, she's just heroic. That's episode 477. Listeners, just a wonderful, courageous woman talking about. But I love where you talk about the lump in your throat, Heidi, because I probably felt the same way when I first started to talk about this. I didn't know it was okay to say the word out loud. And so I think that, I think of what I would do differently as a parent or as a faith leader. I'm not a faith leader right now in my church, but I have served in a YSA assignment. I would probably do a 5th Sunday on this topic and talk about suicide, and maybe even play some of the clips from the Faith Leader Summit, or even do a QPR training.
Yes.
To me, these are all really appropriate topics. A local leader does have flexibility in some of their lesson schedule, or a fireside, or a Thursday night workshop, to talk about these kind of subjects. And I think a lot of members of all faiths really want to talk about these subjects. They're on their minds, they're in their hearts. I visit an 80-year-old, and this topic came up, and he really just genuinely wants to protect his posterity from this potential risk. He knows on some level of brain, this is something that could affect his wonderful family. And So the work you're doing is so needed, and hearing stories. And Sister I'm missing her name right now.
Alberto,
who I think was there.
She gave the closing prayer.
She gave, it was just a beautiful prayer, but her talk in General Conference, if you're LDS and kind of looking for air cover, she had some incredible quotes that obviously you know word for word. But the one that, talking about suicide in appropriate situations doesn't increase the likelihood. And so I think appropriate situations is what we all need to consider in our areas of stewardship and influence to talk about this subject. And the tools that you're providing help us know how to talk about it. So I'll kind of send it back your way for other things you want to share.
Richard, as you were just talking, you said a couple things that, really kind of excite me, because you mentioned QPR as well as like teaching in a fifth Sunday. And it's because, Benée and I have both had this opportunity. I've taught dozens and dozens of QPR classes, but far and away my favorite are doing these in a faith setting. And whether that's, to a bishop's council or to a youth group, or we have done like ward fifth Sundays. And I love it because you can literally see in the body language of those where you're having this conversation, kind of going from this like uptight to like hearing this word like, whoa, we're really going to go there. We're really going to talk about suicide. And then as we go throughout and we, and some of them that I've taught, we've started like with a clip from Elder Ballard where he's talking about keeping our antennas up and open and looking out for those that may be concerned. And people start to realize like, I'm safe here. I can talk about this here. I can not only come and worship here, but I can bring all of me and this depression that I have and this anxiety that I can have. And I can come to this faith place and be open and vulnerable about that, and also seek to find answers and healing from that, from God, and also from the people that I'm connecting with that may be struggling with the same thing. So it's a beautiful thing to see that. And, one of the things we teach in QPR, or we mention, is that there's, up in Washington State, they're really good at CPR. And at one point, I think the stat was, and it's been several years since I've looked to have this updated, but 1 out of 4 people in Washington State are trained in CPR. So the chances are, whether I'm at Walmart or at the park or at my son's school, and if I had a medical emergency, somebody around is going to be able to help. Well, would that save lives? Absolutely. But what if we apply that to mental health? If we all think in our own cities, if 1 out of 4 people was trained to know and recognize the warning signs of suicide, and then even more, had the courage to act with compassion to make a difference, would that change the way you felt about the city that you lived in? And then apply that to your faith group or your family. Does that make your faith group a place you want to be even more? Does that increase the safety that's found there? And overwhelmingly, people are like, yes, like we want that. And when you bring QPR to a congregation or any group, you can literally watch that transformation happen. It's one of my favorite things.
That was I think that was the hardest thing when the church took away
changed
3 hours to 2 hours. The 2 hours, we had just really started teaching QPR on fifth Sundays. Like every fifth Sunday, I was teaching QPR.
Yes.
And then they took that hour away, and we all were really sad.
That made it a little more difficult, but
because it gave us extra time.
Yes.
But I would love to just share like a quick. I did a QPR on a fifth Sunday in a ward close by here in the Holiday area, and I got a phone call a couple days later from the lady who had invited me to come do this QPR training. And she talked about how a lady in the ward who had participated in that fifth Sunday through the whole QPR training had this woman's name that kept coming to mind. So after church, she went and, knocked on the lady's door, and she found her curled up in the fetal position, ready to be done. And if she hadn't been at church that day, taking that training, what would have happened to her cute little ministering sister?
Wow.
And that was such a testimony to me, or a strength to me, that God knows when we take these trainings, He puts people in our lives to make sure that we can keep them safe and help them. But QPR, suicide prevention, is ministering.
Yeah.
That is how Christ would minister. That is how we take care of one another. We look for those signs. We look for those warnings, those behavior changes. And then we reach out and we ask if they need help. We provide that help, that love and support.
Yeah.
Let me ask a question. If a local leader is listening, or a parent, and wants to do QPR and say, yeah, I encourage you to act on your inspiration. There's a lot of things in your control you can do in your stewardship. Even though we're right, we've gone to 2-hour church, there's still evenings, there's firesides, there's a lot of formats. You could even have people come into your home. But would you encourage a local leader to go on the website and just show QPR? Could they do it on their own? Or could they get trained on their own and then teach it? Or would you encourage them to find someone like the two of you that are trained in QPR that then can come in? So give leaders, and there may be people listening to this podcast that aren't even in the United States that say, yeah, I want to do this in my area of influence.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple things they can do. If you go to that Live On website, and did you say it's under resources and then faith?
Click on faith.
If you click on faith, there's, like Benée said, there we have several recordings on there, and one of them from last year is actually a QPR for faith leaders. So that may be a good place for faith leaders to start. If they want to just kind of feel like they're getting a sense of what it's all about, they could listen to that. For a congregation, I definitely would recommend that you bring in trained facilitators. Like several other trainings there is a process you go through. There's a way to teach this the most correctly to have the most benefit. There's a number of amazing QPR trained facilitators throughout our state. And you can actually request a training right there on the website. Maybe we have faith leaders out there that would like to become QPR certified and become trainers. And I'm sure that would be welcomed as well. So you can do that on the website. But
I would also say, just as for some other ideas or options, you can, courtesy of COVID, we can do the trainings online.
Yes.
We can do them in person. Just as a follow-up, or because of the Faith Summit this past year, we had 2 individuals who are over service mission presidents in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they reached out to us because they wanted all the service mission presidents trained in QPR across the country. So right now, so far, we have trained, I think, close to 70 mission leaders across the country and in Canada. And we've been doing them virtually. And we've had a couple follow-ups after these cute mission leaders, or they're overall the service missionaries in their communities. And these are young people who either because of mental health reasons or physical reasons, or maybe they've come home early from their missions, they're serving service missions. So some of them have come home because they've had thoughts of suicide or they've had struggles. And we've been able to train these mission leaders, these mission presidents in QPR. We've had a couple stories come back. I think it was in our August training that this mission president and his wife got a phone call from a sister missionary who was already, in process of trying to take her life. And they were able to use the skills that they got in this, 1.5 hour training to get in the car, get on the phone with the hospital, get to this young lady, and saved her life.
That's great.
We had a couple other emails that came through that said they had been able to, get to the young man before he even got to that point. But I say this because there's such a value in training individuals who have, that have the opportunity to serve to have the skills to save lives, because it really is such a powerful thing to know what to do when you see those signs and symptoms.
I love that.
So I say that because we're doing it. We're training faith leaders right now, and we would love to see it.
Yeah,
To see it church-wide.
It's so exciting because it really is one of those butterfly effect things, right? Like one person learns a skill. And something I've come to learn to say in QPR trainings, it's not this royal if you encounter somebody that's having thoughts of suicide, but it's a win. It's a win. And I love that we're sharing stories here, and stories can have such an impact. But when I was going through my first QPR facilitator training, as I sat through that, I could not keep my oldest son off my mind. At the time, he was newly away at college. He was an early return missionary. He was struggling with depression. And he also had, is same-sex attracted and was, trying to figure out how to navigate that road. And I couldn't get him off my mind. And as I went through this training, my stark realization was that when this training was done, I had a responsibility as a mom to have this conversation. And it can create some adrenaline. That can be a very vulnerable, scary thing. And it's one thing, it takes courage, and it will raise some adrenaline and maybe raise some blood pressure. Probably every time you have this conversation, it does become easier. And maybe just for the listener's benefit, I'll share how this conversation went with my son. But I was done with this training, and we would talk regularly on the phone, and we were having just a regular how's your day kind of conversation. And, my heart was beating so loud, when you can hear your own heart beating in your ears, I was totally having that sensation. And as we got to a point in this conversation where I could ask the question, I said, son, I know life's really hard for you right now. And I want to tell you, I've been to this training for the last several days about suicide prevention. And I don't feel like I would be a good mom if I didn't ask you, have you had thoughts of suicide? And at that moment, it's like, whoo, I did it. I got the question out, right? Like, whoo, good job. But was the scariest part over? There's this lingering moment there where so much is hanging in the balance with the answer. And I'll never forget my son's answer. And what he said to me was, Mom, I have had thoughts of suicide. I'm not having them now. And I don't feel like that's something that I could ever do. But the last thing he said is what stuck to me the most, and what is why I am so passionate and I love QPR so much, because he said, Mom, thank you for asking. And so, we talked a little bit earlier about how sometimes there can be this belief of, and it's really stigma, right? And we know that there is a lot of stigma about a lot of issues, and certainly there is that about suicide. But we feel somehow when things that have the stigma attached to it, if we talk about it, that we're going to increase the risk. And that one conversation with my son blew that out of the water, because what his response told me is like, Mom, I know that you love me enough to go there.
Wow.
That the love is strong enough that, yeah, we'll go where it's uncomfortable. We'll go where it's downright terrifying, and we will have that conversation. And what I also learned was, I done having that conversation with my son. It's not something I could just check off my box for the day and whoo, I did it. We're done. We're through it. No, life doesn't work that way. But it was a conversation that we had several times since. And in fact, in years to come, he actually moved to New York City. That was vulnerable as a mom, to let this kid that felt very high at risk for me to let him go that far away. But we developed this system of like, where are you today on a scale of 1 to 10? If he was above a 5, we knew things were okay. If he was at 5 or below, that meant, hey, I needed to send more texts, check in with him more often. How are you doing? And over time, it became a much easier conversation to have. And I could say I could have it now without feeling even a percentage of that terror like that I was feeling at that moment. But it's become open. And by the way, that son is thriving now. He's back here in Utah. He's doing wonderful things. And I'm so grateful that we were able to have those conversations. But in our congregations, in our homes, in our families, when we're able to have this conversation with sensitivity, with compassion, without blame and without judgment, there's really no telling how far that can go to help save a life.
That's a beautiful segment. And thanks for sharing some of your personal story. That makes it sort of more real life for listeners to say, okay, this is not just theoretical. This is how it was applied in Heidi's family. And that was a really helpful segment. You mentioned something, Heidi, earlier on, sort of, and I know you talk about this in church settings, is sometimes we have a culture, it can be even toxic perfectionism, where we, and both of you are nodding your heads right now as where we have a culture where culturally we want to present our best selves and have the best comments at church, and that can be very helpful at times. Those comments can be helpful, but the culture creates a feeling that vulnerability is not allowed here. It's not accepted here. So if you're really working through something like suicidal, I didn't say that right, ideation, that this is not a safe place for me. I don't know if my local leaders, my bishop, my Relief Society president, there's never been any cues that I could talk to my ministering sister, my ministering brother, my bishop about this. So for local leaders that kind of recognize that, what things can they do to help change the culture so at least people know they're safe?
Yeah, this is another hot topic for me that I get really excited about. And it really came about because after doing so many QPRs, one of the things we talk about in QPR will show data for, wherever you live, what are the suicide rates, right? We want to really look at it and understand. And, Utah doesn't have boasting rights when it comes to this kind of thing. Unfortunately, we're
opposite.
Yeah, we're stayed in that top 10, right? Over the last several, we've changed rankings a little bit, but still in the top 10. And whenever we bring that out and we ask this question, to whoever's listening, and we say, why are the rates so high in Utah? What do you all think? And inevitably, and this is what really, sometimes I couldn't sleep at night because this was always among the first or second answer, especially in LDS groups, is people would say things like, well, because the church expects us to be so perfect. Or it's, people are so judgy here and we can't measure up because we're so perfect. And in one group, I even had a bishop that raised his hand and said, because of the church's expectations on us. Like I said, I was losing sleep because I could see that, I could feel what they were saying. But as I analyzed it, I said, wait, is it the intention of any leader in the LDS church or other congregations to create an atmosphere where people are feeling so isolated and hopeless that they want to die, And of course, the answer to that is no. That is not in the doctrine. It's certainly not in the intention. And yet something's happening within the culture, the stigma stuff, and the way we interact with each other, where we feel like that if we don't present our best, if we're not doing our best. And I dug in and did a little bit more research. Some of your listeners may be acquainted with Benée Brown, who's a shame researcher. I love her stuff and I love reading it and kind of applying it to our current faith cultures. And I had kind of this aha moment as she defined shame. And I love this because she says that shame, and I'm paraphrasing here, is this intensely painful realization that we're human and we're flawed, right? And I kind of chuckled at that because it's like, oh, surprise, we're all human and we're all flawed. And like we know that, but we try to hide it every day because shame tells us that like if you're flawed and people find out your flaws, that you're somehow less worthy of love and belonging. And in fact, that you might not be worthy of love and belonging if people find out about this thing. And I love how I just call it a truth bomb, because it's like, oh, that's just so powerful and impactful. And, there's a lie and a truth there. The truth is that we're all flawed. We're all flawed. And we have faith and we have these congregations so that we can come together and find this hope and this belongingness. And so I would encourage faith leaders to talk openly about that, to help us find joy in our faith by finding that redemption, by finding, joy in repentance, in connection with other people and with a higher power. And to recognize in our own souls and our own minds where we're getting tripped up. Like, what are we telling ourselves that if I don't measure up to this, that I'm not worth it? Because if we really challenge that, we'll probably find a lie in there somewhere. And as I was coming to realize this, I had teenagers in the house, and when my kids would get really worked up or emotional or upset, and we'd need to hey, let's talk. What's going on here? I came to find that if I said first and foremost, I call them little monsters, those little liars in our head. What are the purple monsters telling you? And almost always they come out pretty quick. Well, I guess I'm believing that if I don't get 110% on the test tomorrow, that my whole life is ruined, And you can debunk that and say, what if we just choose to believe that you're going to do your best and everything's going to work out okay, and that you're still infinitely loved and your worth is not affected at all? Those can be really powerful conversations. And by the way, not just to have with others, but with ourselves. And I still have to have them with myself.
I think we all need those conversations, right?
We all
in the
need
mirror.
that check-in to say, wait, where am I letting those lion little purple monsters take the wheel? And let me take that back and recognize that we're all flawed. We're all trying to do better. And that as we try to connect with our higher power, with our purpose, and with each other, that we can find the fruits of that, which are going to bring more hope and belongingness. I think the other thing I'd address with that too is that sometimes I think that we create in our faith cultures, well, if we just pray more, if we repent more, if we spend more time in our scriptures, and as faith leaders, those are kind of the default things that they can fall on to give spiritual counsel. And so another part of that stigma is recognizing that it's okay to seek professional help. Not only is it okay, but
recommended.
It's very recommended. Just like if you had a broken arm, it's a powerful thing to think about our brain just as another organ. It's this organ between our ears that sometimes gets sick, just like our bellies get sick. We would never judge somebody with a sick pancreas that has diabetes, and shame them or turn away because, we just don't want to go there, right? But yet when we're struggling with anxiety or depression, thoughts of suicide, ideation, it's really just alerting us that something's not well there. And we have professionals that are trained to recognize and to treat those things. And so I think that's something that I'd let listeners know too, is that when you ask somebody, when you reach out, and this is covered very well in QPR, when you're reaching out with compassion to ask somebody if they're having thoughts of suicide, like I did with my son, that doesn't then mean that I'm qualified to go in and fix everything that's happening with him, right? Just like CPR, I'm the one that intervened quickly to recognize that there was an issue. And then I can connect my son to those resources, maybe to the medicines, to the therapy that he needs that is then going to help him. Just like if it was a person with a heart attack, right? And if I revive somebody with CPR, am I qualified to go in and do the triple bypass surgery that would save his life? That would be the most dangerous thing for that person ever.
Yes, it would.
Couldn't even begin to approach that. but I could save a life by doing CPR. And our listeners, everybody out there, when they know these skills, they can save lives simply by showing compassion, asking a question, and then connecting that person to the professional help. So I think reducing that stigma around that is really important to remember also.
Benée, I'd love to get your thoughts on this or anything else you want to share. And then I have some thoughts on Heidi's great segment there.
Yeah, I kind of want to just echo ditto to all of that because it is so true. I was at a book club this week with a lot of my friends in my neighborhood, and we were talking about after the shame we have as parents when our kids don't follow that perfect path that we somehow expect that they should take. And it goes into that shame that why do we have a group of women or congregants together where when things aren't going, perfectly, wouldn't we want to rally our arms around one another and support and love in kindness and compassion? And I think that goes when you've got someone who's having thoughts of taking their life or they're having, anxiety or depression or panic attacks. Shouldn't we as followers of Christ want to let them know that we're there, that we are there to give them the hug and the comfort and the support and just to listen? I think that is so much of why I love QPR, why I love to teach people about suicide prevention, because it isn't big and scary. It really is just what we've all promised that we would do as followers of Christ, that we're going to mourn with those who mourn and comfort those who stand in need of comfort. And what a wonderful opportunity we have to be there for one another.
It's a really good segment. Just some thoughts. I think of QPR and I think of missionaries that are serving, and also, and you two know this, and often that's the first sign of mental health issues is on a mission. And I've wondered, and I'm thinking out loud, that wouldn't QPR be a great thing to have as part of mission prep class? You might learn that in yourself, but you might have skills also to help your companion. Often it's the companion in an isolated area in the country that's dealing with a companion that clearly has mental health issues. One of the young men in our stake was talking about this. He's really educated on the subject, and he's actually teaching mission prep class. And some of the instruction was to read positive scriptures to companion. And he says, well, he didn't quite feel comfortable with that. He thought he should ask questions about what's really going on. And the positive scriptures just may isolate that kid more to know he's not a safe person. And this is something I shouldn't talk about, and just creating shame around it.
Well, and I also think it's that idea of reading your scriptures more isn't going to make it go away.
Exactly.
Right? If you don't deal with why they're struggling, why they're unhappy, why they're depressed, reading scriptures more is just going to make you feel worse because it didn't make you feel better. I'm praying, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do.
If you're going to mission prep or in charge of content for mission prep, I just think I'd invite you to consider having QPR part of that.
I think that's a great idea.
I would have sent our missionary sons through that. If everything I know now, it would have helped them, but it would have helped the people they're working with.
Absolutely.
I wish mission presidents, stake presidents, and priesthood leaders probably had more training in this area. We give really good training in lots of categories, and I just think that's an area for improvement.
Yeah. And to that point, I think that's why these faith summits have been so popular, because a lot of them are, for example, in the LDS Church, you have men from all different professions that are asked to counsel on these spiritual and emotional things. And like I think Benée mentioned this word earlier, there's this hunger to know more. And at this year's Faith Summit, the table I sat at, we were privileged to sit with a bishop, I think from Utah County, that had a member of his congregation come to him. And I just have so much respect for this bishop, because he took a day off work to be there for us. And I don't know how he got connected or heard about it, but he took the day off work to come and to sit with us, to listen and to learn so that he could better help this member of the congregation. I certainly, missionaries, I love that. We have a son serving right now too in the Boston area. And yeah, what a powerful thing for them to be able to recognize it. A lot of times maybe they just think, it could be easy to think a lazy companion's just a lazy companion when maybe there's really some legit depression there and some conversations that could be had to bring help and hope, and then to connect them with some resources.
I love that. And, I've got a new book coming out, listeners, in the spring. It's called Listen, Learn, and Love, Improving Latter-day Saint Culture. And one of the chapters is mental health. And in that chapter, I open up about seeing a therapist for the second time in my life while serving as a YSA bishop, and feeling shame that if the YSAs knew that I would be, and I was actually glad, and I wrote this in the book, to be really vulnerable and honest, that my therapist lived in a different part of the city, because I thought, what would the YSAs think of me if they saw me going in to see a therapist? And I thought it, in the book, I just said, in an appropriate situation or ward, I would go back and tell the YSAs I was seeing a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's no shame in that, even though I had internalized a bunch of shame, and perhaps that would have communicated to the YSAs, even in a number of areas, that, okay, this guy's pretty transparent. He's pretty vulnerable. I can talk to him about, I may not have mental health issues I need to talk about. I need to talk to him about this kind of stuff. And just the fact he was vulnerable in an appropriate way creates this kind of culture you're talking about. So I would go back and do a do-over on that. And I would take the shame away that I felt at the time. And my mental health issues weren't life or death, but they were such that I knew I needed a therapist. My therapist was just terrific. And I'm in a better spot. I've also thought about, I was thinking also, as you were talking, Heidi, about, you used the word, well, I wrote down the words outcomes and milestones. And often we're so focused in our culture on outcomes, like a temple marriage or these outcomes. And all of those are good. I'm not saying those aren't good, but often that creates a culture of expectation, or culture we're so focused on the next outcome, getting married or getting that degree or getting that mission under our belt. And I sense that there's some challenges in our culture that if you don't feel those outcomes are within your reach or your path, or we're just talking about the outcomes, we're not able to talk about the reality of people's situations, because we're always talking about the next step on their path. So there's just a balance there, listeners, that I think we need to be sensitive to. So I'll turn it back to either of you just to continue to share thoughts that are coming to your mind or that you've prepared.
Yeah, I love that. And as you were talking, I think it was President Hinckley that talked a lot about finding joy in the journey, right? And it really is about that, and allowing those, whether it's our children or those in our stewardship, because agency really is such a powerful principle, right? And so, to guide and to focus on values and principles, but this weight of expectation or control of another's journey really is not ours, right? And that's really a projection of maybe our own shame or our own fear of being judged. That's part of all the sticky widget in the culture, right? And what we want to create, and I think really what we understand and respect to be God's way, is to honor agency and to allow a person to choose their path, and to discover what brings them joy, and to get rid of anything that feels like coercion, or, like you said, it's a balance. This unhealthy expectation of, like, if you don't go on a mission, or if you don't get married in the temple, that somehow you will receive less love from us. If that's a person's choice, we want them to be able to embrace that with the full power of them being doing that because that's what they own, right? That brings more power to that decision anyway, if they're doing it of their own volition, other than if it's expected. And I think we hear that with missions too. Sometimes missionaries come home or say, that I just did it because my parents wanted me to. And so, if we can give that power back to the individual of owning their role, and sometimes that can be a vulnerable and scary thing to do as a parent. I've certainly learned that, combined, we have 8 children in all different stages and choices of their lives. But it really is a beautiful thing to surrender that to each child of them taking that ownership in their life.
Wow. I'd love you to talk to, because part of as I went to the website is support for families that have lost somebody to suicide. So we've obviously talked about preventing suicide, but I think you both have some skills and insights. And there may be listeners that have lost a family member to suicide and maybe even tried and done of some of the things that have been to QPR and have really done their best efforts. But this just happened in spite of everybody's best efforts. So you have support groups in place as they're experiencing unimaginable grief and shame and second guessing everything.
Yeah.
And just talk to those families that I think you have some words that would be helpful.
It's heavy, right? It's just heavy. And it's like we said it at the beginning, like my son who lost this classmate. And one of the things I've noticed when I've taught a QPR, I'll often ask, who in this room has been impacted at all by suicide?
Great question.
And almost always, all the hands go up. So when we're talking about suicide loss survivors, I think that number is a lot larger than we give credit for. And certainly, again, those that are closer to that person that has died, the greater the impact. But because suicide is a death like no other, it's a grieving like no other. It has all those yucky appendages like you just talked about with the blames and the blame and the what ifs, those questions. And so certainly seeking support groups, and I'll let Benée talk to some of those resources that are available. A concept that I found really helpful is this idea of grieving forward. And I've seen this with those that I've had really the honor of associating with that have lost really close loved ones to suicide, is that they turn that grief then into this passion to reaching out and bringing hope and help to others. I know Shayla is such a great example of that. You mentioned her at the start of this podcast, and so many others. Lark Galley that was also on the panel, right? And
she's
had this
terrific.
Tremendous loss with her son. And I could just cry buckets, I have a dear friend that lost her son to suicide a number of years ago. And man, it's deep. And there's such strength, when we can take any of the trials that we experience and then turn that into something that's positive. I think there's great healing in that. But I would also add to that we need to be careful not to judge a person's grieving journey, right? That some might be willing to jump in and be an advocate for suicide prevention right away, and others might need some time or might want to keep that private and do their own, more isolated grieving, hopefully with the right help and supports, right? But
what a thoughtful comment. All of that was really thoughtful. I love the term suicide loss survivors.
Yeah, that's kind of what they're.
Yeah, that's a real thing.
That's label, but that's what we call them.
And I love it because it really, I think, gives credit to that point of the trauma they've been through.
It is a trial, and they've survived something unimaginable.
Yeah. And I think another reason is because, and research does show this, that the risk for suicide goes up tremendously when somebody close to you has died from suicide. And so we want those suicide survivors to continue to be survivors. And I think to even recognize and validate within themselves that trauma has put them at increased risk. To validate that for people that have had that loss can maybe also help encourage them to stay connected to support groups, to therapy, to those that can reach out and help.
I've never thought about extending grace the way you did to suicide loss survivors to walk that road. Lark Galley kind of talked about in the panel about how different members of her family.
Yeah.
But I think, some people do get very involved. I know George and Allison Dutson, who lost their son Stockton. And I've talked about him because he's the one that really connected me to the LGBTQ space. Their son was gay and died by suicide as a teenager. And they have chosen to be, very active in creating a better space for LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. They're two of my heroes. But there's others that have processed this in a more private way and haven't done anything public. And I think what you're saying is, if you're one of those and the way you're healing is to walk this road the way you are, then we'll extend the grace to you to do that the way you know is best. And we're not going to add to your load by sharing your stories of how other people are processing it.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't need to add that expectation, right, on top of all of it.
Or you've got to do something big and grand, start a massive foundation and raise you.
Right.
Just do this the way you need to do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think so many of them do it so well. Their AFSP has walked.
Yes.
And sometimes that's all it is, that they're walking for that family member so that they're always remembered.
And that's a simple way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And AFSP is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So they have a great website and host walks and that kind of thing. And I had another thought. It'll come back to me. But just this idea of when we lose somebody to suicide, to really take care of ourselves. That's what it was. And we teach this in QPR of we're told if we ever go on an airplane, I was on one recently and they still do this, the little speech there at the beginning. They have to run you through those protocols if there was an emergency and you had to use that oxygen mask, right? I know we kind of all tune that out now. But the idea that they're teaching is, if that oxygen mask is deployed, that we want to make sure we first put it on ourselves and then help those around us. So I guess to those grieving, that we understand and respect and want to validate that they're at higher risk, that would be my advice there, is that make sure you're giving yourself the oxygen that you need. Do what you need to heal what's hurting inside of you. And then if you feel called to it, if you feel excited about the idea of reaching out and being an advocate and having that in a more public space, do it. But certainly, like you said, let's not add this as an expectation or add a shame to it if that's not what somebody chooses to do.
Would you two talk to those that are thinking of suicide as they're listening to this podcast?
I think what I have learned over the last few years is that you are loved, even though, like Heidi said, those little purple monsters in your head make you think that you're not. You are loved, and there are people around you who love you. And if they are not seeing the signs that you are struggling, just tell them, because they will be okay with it, because they will want you to live and want you to get the help that you need. And I think the more we can take away that shame and that stigma, because so often we think, how can I be having these thoughts that makes me not worthy of that love from others? But it's why we're here and why we do what we do, is so that people understand that they have value and they are loved. I think that is one of the most important things as we talk about suicide, is that we make it okay to talk about suicide. And we understand there's a quote that we have in our trainings that talks about all of the suicide deaths. Most people who think about suicide go on to live. 90% get the help they need, and they don't die by suicide. So we want to make sure that we're having that positive narrative in our head. Everybody goes through hard things and we get through it. Let's focus on that and make that what we champion, that you struggled and you got through it. And what it is that you did to get through it. Because I think the more we are open and talking about what we did to get through those hard times, it makes us less vulnerable to having that shame in our own head, in our own space.
Yeah, beautiful.
Beautiful, Benée.
I would just add to that, just simply to anybody out there struggling, you are heard, you are seen, and you matter. I had somebody once describe this feeling of suicide ideation, of wanting to die, as being in a car. That's engine worked just fine, but they're locked on the inside. And there's 3 inches of thick mud on the windshield. So even though like everything physically about the car, the engine's okay, they can't see down the road. And what a hopeless feeling that is. And yet for that person in that car, is there hope? Yeah, but not without somebody from the outside.
Wow.
Somebody that can come with the tools to get that mud off. It's more than turning on the windshield wipers can handle, right? It would break the windshield wipers. Sometimes the simple things that we all do for mental health maintenance aren't enough. And if we find we're doing those things and we're still feeling heavy and like we can't get on top of it, we need help from the outside. And just like somebody could come bring a chisel and get that mud off with consistent help from professionals, people like Benée said, 90% of those that struggle with ideation go on to live, and not only live, but live with hope and thrive. And my son's also an example of that. And not to say that his journey's not over yet, right? And that's the other amazing thing is, right now, some of your listeners may be really struggling with ideation. Others may think that that's something they can't relate to. Well, it might be one day, where any of us can be vulnerable for some kind of whammy or situation to happen in our life that puts us there, that puts us in that car with that thick mud on the windshield. So please, if you're listening, recognize that there are resources. There's hope, there's help, there's people. If you don't feel seen and heard, there's people that want to see you and want to hear you and want to create.
And if you feel like you don't have someone, call the Lifeline. There are people there.
How did they get to the Lifeline?
1-800-273-TALK. And it'll route you to wherever you are in the country, to your local crisis line. Here in Utah, it goes to Huntsman Mental Health. But call the Lifeline.
Can you give the numerical too? Just because I know some of these phones don't even. You're going to look it up.
Is it 9255? I have to think about it.
They'll look it up, and I'll just make.
I think it's 9255.
We'll come back to that.
Come back to that.
A model that's been helpful for me that I assume you two know better than I do is the Joyner model. Thomas Joyner talked about a model of suicidality, and I don't have any training in this area, but 2 of the circles he drew of the 3 are this thwarted belongingness, which is the feeling you just don't belong, and a perceived burdenness, which is a lie in your head, that lie that my family's actually better off without me, and the world is better off without me. And I've always thought about in the context, especially for LGBTQ people, that their existence on itself is ruining their eternal family. So I don't want to put ideas in your head, but my experience is to talk about these openly, that somehow my existence is ruining my eternal family, which is a complete lie and not true. And just the things these 2 women said are the things I'd say to you. But what we can do to help people feel like they belong and help people to realize that they're not a burden. In fact, they're a joy. And I like to sometimes think of your older selves talking to you and what they'd say to you post these suicide ideation stages, and how if your older self could talk to you right now, if you are in that state, the things they'd say to you. I love your car analogy, Heidi, in the mud. Someone I was talking to once who was, pretty suicidal I said, what about the light at the end of the tunnel? And they said, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And that was really sobering for me. No one has ever told me that before. And it's mud all over their car. And they didn't have the tools to see that light at the end of the tunnel. And I was so honored they told me that's how they felt. But what you talked about is what we need to do to scrape that mud so they can see out the windshield. So pretty tender subject, listeners, and I get tears in my eyes. I think about this. So I'd love to keep the conversation going. I just want to, that's all. I did want to give a shout out to Travis Bear, who you mentioned, who's doing incredible work, and really look up to him and admire the work he's doing. For Deborah and Don Coe, who do a lot of, those two do a lot of QPR training and have helped mentor me in this space and connected me with you, Benée, to do this in the first place. And they're just terrific members of our community also. But I'd love to turn it back to you for kind of close to cutting comments. We don't need to close right now if you have more stuff, though. I don't want this to end prematurely.
One of the things I was thinking of as we were talking about, for those lost survivors, especially at this time of year, at Christmas time, many people don't know we have this really amazing resource at the University of Utah called Caring Connections. Dr. Kathy Supiano does these grief support groups, these loss groups. Many of them are low cost or free of charge. She does this grief during the holiday, which is amazing. I think it was actually this week, but you go to Caring Connections, you can see, but she is also presented at every single one of our faith summits. So, if you're a faith leader or you're interested or you want information, Kathy Supiano's Caring Connections is a invaluable resource for our community.
Beautiful. I love Kathy Supiano. She does great work. I think another thing that I would add, another resource that's available, often there is a link between suicidality and substance use. And I just want to draw attention that there's really power in this idea of coalitions. We talked about that at the beginning. And a coalition is people coming together from all different sectors to address things that are putting people at risk. So to prevent substance abuse and some of those shared risk factors between substance use and suicidality, you can go to utahprevention.org, and there you'll find coalitions all over our state. We have so many great people out there doing fantastic things. And so if that some of the things we're saying here are calling to you, you can go to that website, reach out, ask questions. What's being done to prevent substance use? Certainly we know, kids that initiate in substance use, they're putting themselves at a higher risk for some of these mental health problems, and vice versa. Our kids that are struggling with mental health are at a higher risk for substance use and engagement. So reach out, find out what's going on in your community, start where you're at. And, there's a difference everybody can make. I've said before, that substance use and suicide prevention is my business, but it's really everybody's business. So I think that would be kind of my closing message to everybody out there is we hope you're not listening to this and thinking, oh, well, that's what Heidi and Benée do for a living. And I'm so glad that there's people out there that have this covered, because we can't do that without every person coming to know their responsibility when it comes to suicide prevention and doing that part. That's how our work gets done.
Yeah, so we have like this line that we use in suicide prevention. Suicide prevention is everyone's business. Like everyone can prevent suicide. So don't think that it doesn't apply to you, because it does. It applies to all of us. And if I can, one of the things we haven't really talked about this much today, but I always have to feel like I need to stand on my soapbox. When we talk about suicide, we always talk about our youth and our young people.
Good point.
And that's great. Our youth suicide rates are higher than some of the other states, but guess what? Our adult men die by suicide 70%. Like 70% of all of our suicide deaths, I said that wrong. 70% of all suicide deaths in Utah are adult men between the ages of 24 to, I don't know, it just changed, 24 to about 65. So if you're hearing our conversations today about suicide, think about all those people that are in your circle of influence, especially if they're adult men, because our adult men don't they have more of shame, like Richard talked about, of seeing a therapist or talking about their mental health. But we need to change that stigma and that culture around talking about it, because we don't want to lose another husband, another brother, another friend that then leaves that ripple of families that have to be a suicide loss survivor. So I know our youth, we don't want our youth to die either, but I think sometimes we do a disservice to not talk about that elephant that's in the room.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up too. And Richard, when you shared your story about going to therapy and just all those feelings that were coming up, that's a pervasive attitude in our country, really. As Americans, we kind of have that pull up your bootstraps, and that's, I think exponentially more on men than on women. Women, we kind of have this culture that, lean on me and let's go to
We're more
lunch and bare our
sensitive.
souls, more
We talk
sensitive,
about it.
talk our feelings out. But, like when you look at, things like our veteran population, first responders, a lot of times, and not to say that women aren't in those professions and those arenas too, because they certainly are. But like Benée said, that data is out there around men. And so the power of you, Richard, getting up as a bishop in a YSA ward or any congregation and just saying, I was at therapy last week. And, even just as a start to a sentence right there, you just gave permission for others to be like, I could go to therapy, and like, that could be an okay thing. Powerful.
And sometimes men, and maybe we do this, is we wait and share our experiences once we're done. So now I'm out of therapy. So now I'm more likely
to feel safe.
I'm
right?
going to say, but what you said was even, I'm in therapy. Elder Holland, when he talked that broken vessel talk, I think he was sort of past that crisis of his emotional health. And it was still a great talk. I don't want to take it. But what you said, I think, is important for a culture that we sometimes keep all this private until the crisis is past, and then we'll talk about it. But I think we can talk about it in the journey is often really helpful. To your point, I love what you said about Benée, and it reminded me of a podcast we did, and I'll just reference this, listeners. Episode 220 is Dr. Joe Kramer, pediatric doctor, our own pediatric doctor in our own ward here, who is a past president of the Utah Medical Association, who came very close to dying by suicide. And he talks about the very things you talk about as a medical doctor, the shame around someone in that profession. And he was really vulnerable on the podcast and just talked about his plan. And, he went through it all. And then he talked about why he chose not. And he's honest about his emotional health. And that hasn't been, he isn't like to the finish line yet. He's one of the most vulnerable guys in our own congregation, just being honest with his emotional health. And part of and this may be helpful, is he realized he had, even though he was in such a tough spot, his mind was logical enough. He says, I'm worried I'm going to teach my family members this is how you solve problems, which is sort of your point about sometimes this multiple family members. And so any reason you choose not to die by suicide, I think, is a good one. And so I was glad he shared that. It was really interesting for me to hear that. And it's probably good for other more adult people that have a posterity already here that could cognitively say that's would be. So it's just a thought. But that's episode 220. It's a couple years old, but it was really a great episode. To your point, Benée, is this isn't a youth thing. I'd love you, if there's anything I've said that you'd just love to correct a little bit, just because you have professional training that you were a little uncomfortable with, or there's anything I've said, I'd be sure willing to. I want this to work for our listeners.
You've done such a great job.
Wonderful. It's a great conversation. I think one thing that's always when we have the chance to clarify, there are safe ways to talk about suicide that are a little bit more promoting of people feeling safe and hope-seeking and feeling less judged. So an example of that, if we don't want to say, hey, Robbie is suicidal, but to say, hey, Robbie's experiencing feelings of suicide ideation,
that's
right?
tone
We wouldn't
is better.
say, again, to somebody with cancer, so and so is cancer. It's not the entirety of who a person is. So we want to be careful with those labels, and even with something as far as saying they committed suicide. That one we hear a lot.
And tell us what's better.
And so what we want to hear, what's safer, is to say so and so died by suicide. It was the cause of death. That can be less shaming.
Because if you think about the word committed, what comes to your mind? Committed a sin, committed a crime.
Even committed to a hospital, right? It has a negative connotation to it. So sometimes these things just become a very regular part of vocabulary. We hear it and we use it, but just little shifts like that.
Know better, we do better.
Yes, there you go.
Yep. And we want people to, especially if you're thinking of those survivor families, we don't want to place judgment on their child who took their life or their family member. It's not our, and when we say committed, that judgment is already there.
Well, I think we'll close, listeners. I've just really enjoyed this conversation. It gives me hope to hear the things you're doing, the organizations you're doing, your level of understanding and expertise in this area, the fact that your voices and others like yours are being more heard and more understood in many circles. Listeners, we've mentioned a lot of links, and we'll put those in the show notes. I'll make sure to get it. We've talked about a coalition. I want to make sure to get that in there, and all the different groups. You can scroll through the podcasts just to make sure you didn't miss anything that would be a helpful resource to you that you can scroll to. So this is, I'm going to get your names right, Heidi Peterson Dutson and Benée Larsen, Larscn, and Richard Osler, signing off on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.